Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of the progressive era. Our question to think about here, what are the three main aspects of progressivism and what makes them progressive? When we take a look at progressivism, historians have looked at this from a number of perspectives. Some historians look at it as a top-down movement by focusing on the progressive presidents and Congress who are leading the charge. Others argue that the movement really stems from the grassroots changes at the local levels as individuals are trying to improve their communities or their states, and that's sort of filtering up. Others have looked at progressivism as categories, like what kinds of changes were people looking to initiate. And we could really look at an expanded number of categories, but in order to keep things simple, we're going to focus on three. And the first of which is democracy. And by that, I mean, we're looking at restoring the power of government to the people of the United States. And there has been some concern throughout the Gilded Age that the government has become more corrupt and that many things are now outside of the power of the people. So we're looking at ways to give that power back. The first example is direct primary. So because we're in a presidential election year, this is pretty easy for us to visualize. The Democrats are searching for a candidate. And so through the primaries, the people are voicing their opinions. Do you want someone who is more liberal, like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, or would you prefer a candidate who is more moderate, say Joe Biden or Amy Klobuchar? So the people are voicing their opinion about which candidate they want. So this is giving the power to the people. Another example is an initiative. This is something that happens at the state and local level where people can initiate a law. So this is the understanding of the initiative is that the state legislature is not doing what we want them to do. So we're going to give some power to the people to start new laws, to initiate new laws. So it starts with a petition saying we want this law to be passed. You collect the signatures on the petition, it's presented to the government, and you're sort of forcing the hand of the state legislature. Very similar to a referendum, which means that the people are pushing for a law to go away, to repeal a law. And so again, starting with a petition with signatures, you're sort of forcing the state legislature to reconsider or to remove a law. Recall has to do with recalling a politician. And so at the state and local level, people have the power to sort of change their minds about someone they have elected. And what makes this interesting is they don't necessarily have to have done anything wrong. It's just an election that is held to decide whether or not we want to keep this politician, even though his term is not up. So it's giving the people the power to bring back people who are not necessarily doing what they want. And I believe the Dallas City Council is facing a recall situation for one of their councilmen at this time. Another example of democracy in America during the progressive era is the ratification of the 17th Amendment. As the Constitution was written, the U.S. senators for each state were chosen by the state legislature. And the 17th Amendment changes that. It makes the U.S. senators elected directly by the people of the state. So you're taking away that middleman. And again, if you're concerned about corruption in your state legislature, you don't want that group choosing your United States senator. And then finally, the 19th Amendment, which grants women the right to vote. And so finally, we have the other half of our population having the right to vote. A second main aspect of progressivism is business regulation. So I mentioned briefly in part one about antitrust movements on the part of the progressive presidents. This is related to the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, and this was the first federal attempt to regulate big business. But the terms of the law were vague and imprecise, and so it wasn't really utilized until Theodore Roosevelt becomes the president, and he actually started to do something about regulating corporations and big business and trying to control corruption. Both William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson are going to follow Roosevelt's trust-busting lead as we break up these big corporations. The Federal Reserve Act was passed by Congress in 1913, and it's important because ever since Andrew Jackson killed the Second Bank of the United States in the 1830s, the United States had been without a central bank, and the financial system in the United States was unstable and inefficient. The Federal Reserve Act created a new national banking system with 12 regional reserve banks supervised by a central board of directors. This is actually a board of governors that we call the Fed. The current Fed chairman is Jerome Powell. The system allows bank reserves to be pooled. So a member of the Federal Reserve would provide resources to a pool that could be tapped later on. And this provides greater security. It makes currency and bank credit more elastic, and it allows the money supply to expand as needed. And it lessened the concentration of reserves in New York, as there would be, as I mentioned, 12 regional banks. This is the system that also produces the Federal Reserve notes. So if you happen to have any paper money on you, you'll notice that it actually is a Federal Reserve note. And this is a dramatic new step in the active government intervention and control of one of the most sensitive segments of the economy. The Federal Trade Commission was created during Woodrow Wilson's presidency, and it replaces Roosevelt's earlier watchdog agency, the Bureau of Corporations. This is a 5-member commission that would define unfair trade practices and be able to issue cease and desist orders when it found evidence of unfair competition among businesses. The FTC, of course, is still with us today. And then finally, another example of business regulation is the ratification of the 16th Amendment, which implements a graduated income tax. We might not think of this as incredibly progressive, but it becomes more so if we consider the fact that corporations are required to pay taxes as well. A third aspect of progressivism is social justice, and this is a little broader category and encompasses a number of different things. Muckrakers. We would call these people expose journalists or investigative journalists. This is your Anderson Cooper, your Dateline NBC, your 60 Minutes. These are those who are investigating issues of chronic urban poverty or unsafe working conditions or child labor or unsafe housing. So back in the day, we had Jacob Riis, Lincoln Steffens, and Upton Sinclair. Many people are familiar with Upton Sinclair because of his 1906 book, The Jungle, where he described the terrible conditions in the nation's meatpacking plants. Here's a quote from The Jungle. He says, "There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and the water from leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race about on it. It was too dark in these storage spaces to see well, but a man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of the dried dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers put out poisoned bread for them. They would die, and then the rats, bread, and meat would go into the hoppers together. So it's kind of a disturbing image, and not surprisingly, shortly thereafter, Congress passes the Meat Inspection Act, which required federal inspection of meat. The Department of Agriculture could impose sanitation standards in processing plants. So if something is USDA inspected, that is the United States Department of Agriculture. In addition, Congress that same year passes the Pure Food and Drug Act, which addresses a concern over dangerous patent medicines. So you would have these individuals claim that they have created a potion, thus the patent part of the medicine name, that could cure all sorts of things, from baldness to cancer and everything in between. But they weren't required to reveal the ingredients of this. So it could be simply sugar and water that does nothing. Or it could contain dangerous ingredients like cocaine or heroin or high doses of alcohol. I mean, imagine somebody advertising a cough syrup for babies that is essentially 90 proof grain alcohol. Your baby could die. He's not going to be coughing, but he's probably going to be dead. So there was nothing to prevent these sort of dangerous products from being on the market. The Pure Food and Drug Act requires manufacturers to list the ingredients on the label, and it creates the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. Another example of social justice was the formation of a larger temperance movement. So this is a movement to ban alcohol. One of the largest organizations at this time was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded in 1894. And initially, this group had much broader goals. They did want to close saloons, but they also wanted to improve prison conditions. They wanted to have safe havens for prostitutes and abused women and children. They supported female labor unions and women's suffrage. But their focal point is that alcohol, they believed, was the root of all of these social evils, and that if we really wanted to make American society better, then we needed to ban alcohol. And so this is a very popular movement during the progressive era because many progressives did see this as an issue. And so as a result, the 18th Amendment was ratified, and this bans alcohol in the United States, specifically the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. And we'll talk more about the impact of prohibition later on with the 1920s. Our final example of social justice is a tragedy that happened on March 25th, 1911. The Triangle Company was a garment maker. They made women's clothing. That's the shirtwaist. It's a blouse that women wore at the turn of the century. The women were working in the upper floors of a 10-story building, and the fire broke out on the 8th floor. There were a number of issues as the women tried to escape. First of all, the doors were chained shut in order to prevent union organizers from meeting with their workers during the day. And the other problem was the maintenance of the building. When many of the women were able to escape onto the fire escape outside, they collapsed because they were rusted because of ill repair. And then when the New York City Fire Department shows up, they have the new ladder trucks, but they only reach the 6th floor, and the fire is on the 8th floor, trapping the women on the 9th and 10th floor. So many of the women had no choice but to jump out of the windows. A reporter on the scene presented this quote: "I learned a new sound. A more horrible sound than description can picture. It was the thud of a speeding living body on a stone sidewalk. 146 workers died that day, and in response to the public outcry, New York state authorities created a factory investigating commission, and the tragedy spurred the passage of 36 new labor laws that are going to be replicated in other states as well, and a push for a national standard for factory safety. So coming back to our questions to think about, what were the three main aspects of progressivism? Democracy, business regulation, and social justice. And what made them progressive? With democracy, you're putting the power of the government back into the hands of the people. With business regulation, you are forcing these big corporations to obey a certain standard, that they're not going to be able to exploit their workers as easily, that they're not going to be able to engage in these cutthroat tactics against their competitors. And then with social justice, it's all about protecting people, whether it is exposing the terrible conditions in meatpacking plants, or saving people from the evils of alcohol, or protecting workers in the workplace. So this really helps to define or explain the progressive era.